5. Of the first horror movies ever made. A journey into cinema's dark beginnings. Introduction. The flickering light of early cinema revealed our darkest fears, before audiences even learned to scream. As you join this journey through horror's genesis, a chilling question emerges. What primordial terrors lurked in the minds of filmmakers who invented fear itself? The answer lies in 5 forgotten nightmares that birthed a genre, each one breaking boundaries that can never be unmade. 1. Le Manoir du Diable, 1896. The birth of cinematic terror. What could possibly terrify audiences who had never seen moving pictures before? Georges Méliès answered with the devil himself. On Christmas Eve, 1896, as the Lumière brothers were still amazing audiences with footage of arriving trains, Méliès unleashed something far more sinister at the Théâtre Robert Houdin in Paris. His 3-minute supernatural spectacle, Le Manoir du Diable, the House of the Devil, introduced cinema's first monster, Mephistopheles himself, materializing from a cauldron in a puff of smoke. Méliès, a former magician turned filmmaker, employed every trick he knew: stop-motion substitutions, multiple exposures, and dissolves. The plot, though primitive by today's standards, was revolutionary. A bat transforms into the devil, who conjures skeletons, witches, and ghosts before being banished by a crucifix. What makes this first horror film so significant wasn't just its supernatural elements, but how it weaponized cinema's inherent unreality. Méliès discovered that film could not only document reality but distort it, creating the perfect medium for manifesting nightmares. His technical innovations weren't mere novelties. They were the first instances of special effects being used specifically to frighten. The reward for those who experienced this pioneering shock? The discovery that fear could be a form of entertainment, a revelation that would transform global culture forever. 2. L'épopée de Faust, 1898, when horror gained narrative depth. How could the emerging language of cinema tell stories worthy of humanity's oldest fears? The answer came when Georges Méliès dared to adapt literature's most infamous deal with the devil. Méliès' Faust and Marguerite, sometimes called The Damnation of Faust, expanded horror's vocabulary by bringing psychological depth to the supernatural. Unlike his earlier experiments, this 7-minute adaptation of Goethe's masterpiece introduced something truly terrifying: the human soul in peril. Shot in 1898 on hand-cranked cameras, the film featured elaborate sets that transformed before viewers' eyes. Méliès played Mephistopheles himself, appearing amid flames and smoke to tempt the scholarly Faust. The film's most enduring image, Faust signing away his soul in blood, became horror's first iconic scene, replicated countless times over the next century. What distinguished this early horror film was its moral dimension. The terror no longer came merely from supernatural apparitions, but from the consequences of human choice. Méliès included scenes of Faust's temptation, his corruption of the innocent Marguerite, and his ultimate damnation, establishing the genre's preoccupation with punishment for transgression. Most remarkably, Méliès managed to convey complex emotions through exaggerated pantomime and pioneering in-camera effects. When Mephistopheles appears in Faust's study, the scholar's visible terror communicated something audiences recognized in themselves: the universal fear of damnation. The reward for viewers brave enough to witness this moral horror. The first glimpse of cinema's power to visualize the eternal battle between good and evil, a theme that would haunt horror films for generations to come. 3. Le Monstre, 1903. Horror's first special effects masterpiece. What happens when a filmmaker becomes obsessed with showing the impossible? Georges Méliès answered with cinema's first truly grotesque transformation. Le Monstre, the monster, marked a turning point in horror filmmaking when it premiered in 1903. This 4-minute nightmare featured the first extensive use of metamorphosis effects in horror, a technique that would later define the genre through films like The Wolfman and The Fly. The premise was deceptively simple. An Egyptian prince brings a skeleton back to life, only for it to transform repeatedly, shifting from skeleton to monster to beautiful woman and back again. What made audiences gasp wasn't just the subject matter, but the seamless execution of these transformations through meticulously planned substitution splices. Méliès shot each scene multiple times, stopping the camera to replace actors or props before continuing, creating the illusion of supernatural change. This required mathematical precision. A single frame's misalignment would reveal the trick. The most chilling sequence shows a woman dissolving into a skeleton while still moving. An effect so convincing that contemporary accounts describe audience members fleeing the theater. Beyond technical innovation, Le Monstre introduced the concept of body horror, the idea that our physical forms could betray us through grotesque transformation. This tapped into primal fears of death, decay, and loss of identity that transcended cultural boundaries. The reward for those who endured this disturbing spectacle, the realization that cinema could visualize our deepest anxieties about bodily integrity, opening a wound in the collective unconscious that horror filmmakers continue to probe today. 4. Frankenstein, 1910. When science became horror's nemesis. How could a medium barely 15 years old tackle literature's most profound meditation on science and humanity? Edison Studios answered with shocking ambition. While Europe pioneered supernatural horror, America's first significant contribution came through a different kind of monster. The Edison Company's 1910 Frankenstein, directed by J. Searle Dawley, introduced the mad scientist archetype that would haunt cinema for decades to come. This 13-minute adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel was revolutionary in its approach to horror. Rather than relying on supernatural elements, it located terror in human ambition gone awry. The creation scene, where the monster forms in a cauldron through chemical processes rather than electricity, remains one of early cinema's most disturbing sequences. Using reverse photography and dissolves, Dawley showed a skeleton slowly gaining flesh in a bubbling vat, creating an effect that horrified 1910 audiences unaccustomed to such explicit imagery. Charles Ogle's portrayal of the monster broke new ground in horror performance. Instead of playing him as merely threatening, Ogle conveyed a tragic, misshapen consciousness, establishing the sympathetic monster as a horror staple. His distorted body movements and expressive face communicated suffering without words, forcing viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about creation and responsibility. Most significantly, Frankenstein established science as horror's new frontier. The film suggested that the modern world's greatest terrors might come not from ancient superstitions, but from contemporary laboratories, an anxiety that would prove prophetic throughout the 20th century. The reward for audiences grappling with this scientific nightmare? The first cinematic exploration of horror's most enduring question: who is the real monster? The creation or the creator? 5. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1912. Horror's first character study. What happens when the monster isn't some external threat but lurks within the human heart itself? Director Lucius Henderson answered with cinema's first psychological horror masterpiece. The 1912 adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, starring James Cruise in the dual role, revolutionized horror by internalizing its threats. Previous films had positioned monsters as outside invaders. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde suggested something far more disturbing. That monstrosity is an inherent part of human nature, requiring only the right catalyst to emerge. Shot on primitive equipment with limited resources, the film overcame technical constraints through innovative cinematography. The transformation scenes relied not on special effects, but on Cruise's physical performance, contorting his face and body to suggest the emergence of Hyde without cuts or dissolves. This approach created a more psychologically realistic horror that forced viewers to confront the continuity between Jekyll's respectability and Hyde's depravity. The film's most groundbreaking aspect was its moral ambiguity. Unlike earlier horror films that clearly delineated good and evil, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde presented a protagonist simultaneously, victim and villain. When Hyde commits his violent acts, the horror stems not from supernatural intervention, but from the recognition of human potential for cruelty. Director Henderson employed pioneering point-of-view shots during Hyde's rampages, making audiences uncomfortably complicit in his actions. These subjective camera techniques would later become fundamental to horror cinema, reaching their apotheosis in films like Peeping Tom and Halloween. The reward for those who witnessed this disturbing character study? The first cinematic suggestion that the most terrifying monsters may be ourselves, an idea that would come to define psychological horror for the next century. Conclusion. As the final frames of these pioneering nightmares flicker before us, what promised revelation awaits? Simply this. The first horror filmmakers didn't merely invent techniques. They excavated fears buried deep in the collective unconscious, creating a visual language for terror that still speaks to us from beyond the grave. Their primitive technologies may seem quaint today, but the primal fears they tapped, transformation, damnation, scientific hubris, and the monster within, continue to haunt us precisely because they were never just fantasies. They were, and remain, the shadows cast by civilization itself.